Imagine a homeless and hungry man, rejected by the owner of a luxury restaurant. He, simply wanting something to eat, is cruelly expelled. The frustration and desperation are visible on his face. But then, a determined woman, who understands the true value of generosity, discovers this injustice and decides to intervene. What starts as a simple act of kindness triggers a series of transformative events. The woman reveals a surprising secret about the homeless man's past, which changes everyone's perception around him. The restaurant owner, who was previously insensitive and arrogant, begins to face a powerful reflection on his actions and values. As the story unfolds, we see how empathy and compassion can have a profound and lasting impact. The homeless man's life begins to transform thanks to the unexpected help, and he, in turn, inspires a wave of kindness and solidarity in the community. The restaurant, once merely a business, becomes a symbol of hope and redemption. Get ready for an emotional story where the past meets the present, revealing that true wealth lies in empathy and generosity. Witness how compassion can create a chain of positive changes and transform lives in unimaginable ways. Don't miss this journey of redemption and hope. You'll want to see every moment. Watch now and discover the power of a simple act of kindness. The restaurant was as busy as ever, with customers coming and going. Among them was a man with a worn appearance, dressed in tattered clothes, and eyes that reflected a difficult past. He entered the restaurant hesitantly, looking around for a place to sit. When a waiter approached, he explained that he was hungry and asked for a meal. However, before the waiter could respond, the restaurant owner, a wealthy and well-dressed man named Richard, intervened. Richard looked at the man with disdain and said, "Sorry, but you're not welcome here. I've told you this before." The man, whose name was Paul, tried to argue, saying he was just looking for a meal to satisfy his hunger. But Richard remained unyielding, reminding him that he had no place in the establishment. Feeling humiliated and rejected, Paul left the restaurant with an empty stomach and a heavy heart. He wandered the streets of New York, reminiscing about better times when he had a stable job and a comfortable life. Life's hardships had brought him to this desperate situation, and every door he knocked on seemed to close before him. As he aimlessly walked, Paul spotted a park bench and sat down, exhausted. He closed his eyes and tried to ignore his growing hunger. It was then that he heard a soft voice ask, "Are you okay?" He opened his eyes and saw an elegant woman with two different colored eyes looking at him with concern. Paul recognized the woman immediately. Her name was Claire, and he remembered her from the times he used to work at the restaurant. Back then, she was also going through tough times, and he used to help her with free meals. Claire was now well-dressed and seemed to have overcome her past struggles. She insisted that Paul accompany her back to the restaurant. Reluctant but with no other options, he agreed. When they entered the restaurant, Richard was visibly irritated to see Paul back. But before he could say anything, Claire intervened. "I want to treat Paul to a meal," she said firmly. Richard looked incredulously at Claire, who began to tell her story. Years ago, when she was homeless and hungry, Paul was one of the few people who offered her help. He fed her when no one else would, and thanks to his generosity, she was able to get back on her feet and build a better life for herself. As Claire spoke, other restaurant patrons began to pay attention. Her story touched many hearts, and some even recognized Paul and remembered their own interactions with him. Richard, however, seemed impervious to the emotions around him, insisting that the restaurant's rules did not allow Paul to stay. Determined to help Paul, Claire tried to negotiate with Richard. She even offered to pay for Paul's meal and several future meals, but Richard firmly refused. "This restaurant is not a shelter," he said coldly. "We are here to do business, not to help the needy." Disappointed, Claire and Paul left the restaurant. Outside, Claire promised Paul that she would find a way to help him. She knew that although Richard had refused, Paul's kindness deserved to be rewarded. As they walked together, Claire began to think of other ways to repay the generosity Paul had shown her years ago. Paul and Claire walked to a small cafe on the corner. As they sat down, Claire ordered 2 coffees and a hot meal for Paul. He was visibly moved by her kindness. "You didn't have to do this," Paul said, tears in his eyes. "I did what anyone would do." Claire shook her head. "No, Paul, Not everyone would do what you did. Many people ignored me, but you were always there to help. Now, it's my turn to give back." Paul began to share more about his recent years. He explained how he had lost his job and subsequently his home. The difficulties piled up, and he never managed to get back on his feet. Claire listened attentively, feeling a mix of sadness and admiration for Paul. In the cafe, Claire and Paul talked for hours. She began to formulate a plan to help Paul get back on his feet. "I have some connections," she said. "I'll see what I can do to find you a job, something that can give you a fresh start." Paul, feeling hopeful for the first time in years, expressed his deep gratitude. Claire not only gave him a hot meal but also a new perspective on life. When they parted ways, Claire promised to get in touch soon with more information. As Claire walked home, she reflected on the importance of empathy and compassion. She knew that her journey to help Paul was just beginning, and she was determined to do everything she could to change his life. Will Claire be able to help Paul get back on his feet? Don't miss the upcoming chapters of this emotional story. If you liked it so far, leave a like to support the channel. Claire went home that night, reflecting on her encounter with Paul. She knew that helping Paul wouldn't be easy, especially given the resistance she faced from Richard. Determined to make a difference, Claire began reaching out to her connections in the New York business sector. She wanted to find a job for Paul, something that could give him a real chance to start over. Meanwhile, Richard, the restaurant owner, was also reflecting on the day's events. He was confident that his decision to expel Paul was the right one. "Business is business," Richard thought. "I can't let emotions interfere." But the restaurant's other employees didn't share that opinion. Many of them remembered Paul and his kindness. They began to question Richard's rigid stance and discuss ways to help Paul, even if it meant challenging their boss. The next day, Claire decided to return to Richard's restaurant. She was determined to try again to convince Richard to help Paul. Upon entering, she found Richard busy but managed to get his attention. "Richard, I need to talk to you," she began. "About Paul." Richard sighed, clearly annoyed. "We've already discussed this, Claire. He's not welcome here." "But you don't understand," Claire insisted. "Paul isn't just another homeless person. He's a human being who needs help. He helped me when I was at my lowest. Please reconsider." Customers around them started to pay attention to the conversation. Claire seized the opportunity to tell her story again, this time with more detail. She spoke about the times Paul had given her food and hope and how it changed her life. As Claire spoke, something unexpected happened. One of the restaurant patrons stood up and joined the conversation. "I know Paul," said the man. "He helped me a few years ago when I was going through tough times." Another customer also stood up. "Me too. Paul gave me a meal when I had nothing. He's a good person." Richard began to feel pressured. He had never seen his customers so united for a cause. He looked at Claire, who had tears in her eyes, and then at the other customers. Maybe, he thought, he was making a mistake. "Richard," Claire said softly, "we all deserve a second chance. Think about it." The pressure from the customers and Claire herself made Richard reconsider his position. He asked everyone to return to their seats and promised to think about the matter. Claire left the restaurant feeling a mix of hope and uncertainty. She knew she had planted a seed, but wasn't sure if Richard would truly change his mind. Meanwhile, Paul continued his daily struggle. He was still on the streets, trying to find ways to survive. He wasn't aware of Claire's and the restaurant's customers' actions, but the hope she had given him the previous day still kept him strong. Richard, on the other hand, spent the night reflecting on the stories he had heard. He had never realized the impact one person could have on so many others. Deep down, he knew Claire was right, but admitting it was difficult for him. The next morning, Richard decided to do something different. He set out early and began walking around the city. He wanted to see for himself the conditions people like Paul faced daily. He passed through parks, shelters, and places where the homeless tended to gather. What he saw changed his perspective. Richard witnessed the harsh reality of living on the streets and how the kindness of strangers could make all the difference. He met people who knew Paul and heard their stories of generosity. Each encounter reinforced the message Claire had tried to convey. When Richard returned to the restaurant, he was determined to do the right thing. He gathered his staff and explained his change of heart. "I was wrong," Richard admitted. "We should help people, no matter who they are. Let's find Paul and offer him a second chance. The restaurant staff applauded Richard's decision. They knew this change would not only help Paul, but also strengthen the restaurant's community. Do you think Richard will be able to find Paul in time? How will this change of attitude impact the lives of everyone involved? If you enjoyed this so far, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters of this emotional story. Paul continued to wander the streets, feeling the weight of the rejection he had endured. He still had hope, thanks to Claire's words, but hunger and the cold were starting to affect his health. Each day felt like an endless struggle, and he wondered if things would ever get better. Meanwhile, at the restaurant, Richard and his team began planning how they could help Paul. They decided they needed to find him as quickly as possible. Some staff members volunteered to go out on the streets and search for him, while others stayed at the restaurant, ready to offer support when he was found. The search for Paul was intense. Richard, now regretting his actions, joined the team in the search. He wanted to show Paul that he was genuinely remorseful and willing to help. As he walked through the streets of New York, Richard began to see the city in a completely different light. He saw the beauty and pain that coexisted on the busy streets, and every face he encountered told a story of struggle and resilience. During the search, Richard met several people who knew Paul. Each had a story to tell about Paul's generosity. One man, who worked at a shelter, shared how Paul always helped distribute food to other homeless people, even when he himself was hungry. These stories deeply moved Richard, reinforcing his determination to find Paul and make things right. After hours of searching, Richard and his team finally found Paul in a park, lying on a bench. He looked frail and exhausted. Richard approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. "Paul," he called gently. "It's me, Richard, from the restaurant." Paul opened his eyes, surprised to see Richard there. "What are you doing here?" he asked weakly. "I came to apologize," Richard said, feeling emotional. "I was wrong to expel you. I didn't realize how much you've done for so many people. I want to offer you a second chance. Please, come with me." Paul hesitated for a moment, but the sincerity in Richard's eyes convinced him. He got up, leaning on Richard, and together they returned to the restaurant. The staff welcomed them with applause and warm greetings, showing Paul that he was truly welcome. Back at the restaurant, Paul was taken to a private room where a hot meal awaited him. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, while Richard and Claire watched, pleased to finally be able to help him. After eating, Paul was shown to a room in the back of the restaurant where he could rest and regain his strength. In the following days, Richard and Claire began working on a plan to help Paul get back on his feet. They helped him obtain new identification documents, enrolled him in social assistance programs, and even arranged a temporary job at the restaurant. Paul was incredibly grateful for all the opportunities being offered to him. As Paul began to rebuild his life, Richard also went through a personal transformation. He became more compassionate and engaged with the community. The restaurant started organizing charity events and offering free meals to those in need. Richard's attitude inspired his staff and customers, creating a more welcoming and supportive environment. Paul, in turn, began to thrive in his new role at the restaurant. He quickly became a beloved figure among the staff and customers, always willing to help and share his story. His presence reminded everyone of the importance of empathy and generosity. Do you think Richard and Paul will be able to maintain this new dynamic of support and solidarity? What other surprises does the future hold for them? If you enjoyed this so far, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters of this emotional story. As time passed, Richard's transformation became evident to everyone around him. He began organizing workshops at the restaurant on the importance of empathy and compassion. These events attracted not only the staff, but also regular customers and local community members. Richard wanted everyone to understand the impact that small acts of kindness could have on the lives of others. Paul, now more stable and confident, frequently shared his story at these workshops. He spoke about how Claire's and others' generosity helped him survive during the toughest times. His words were always inspiring, and many left the workshops with a new perspective on the importance of helping others. One day, during one of these workshops, Claire brought a surprise for Paul. She had managed to track down the woman Paul had helped years ago, the woman with the two colored eyes. Her name was Lisa, and she was eager to reunite with Paul and thank him in person. When Lisa entered the restaurant, Paul was both surprised and moved to see her. Lisa shared with everyone how Paul had helped her when she was hopeless. "If it weren't for Paul, I wouldn't be here today," she said with tears in her eyes. "He gave me food and hope when no one else would. He showed me that there was still kindness in the world." The reunion was a powerful and emotional moment, further reinforcing the message of empathy and generosity that Richard was promoting. Paul and Lisa's stories became a symbol of hope and redemption at the restaurant. Richard, Claire, and the team began documenting these stories in videos and sharing them online, hoping to inspire others to act with kindness. The videos quickly gained popularity, attracting media attention and various charitable organizations. Richard's restaurant became a support center for the needy. They started collaborating with local shelters and social assistance programs, providing meals and job opportunities for those in situations similar to Paul's. The community rallied around this mission, showing that kindness and compassion could truly transform lives. Paul's transformation was remarkable. With a stable job and a support network, he was able to rent a small apartment and return to studying. He wanted to give back to the community that had done so much for him. Paul began volunteering at local shelters, helping others who were going through difficulties similar to what he had faced. Richard, in turn, realized that the success of his restaurant came not just from profits, but from the difference it was making in people's lives. He became a role model for other local business owners, demonstrating that it is possible to run a successful business while helping the community. The decision to help Paul brought unexpected rewards, not just for Paul, but for everyone around him. The story of Paul and Richard spread throughout the city, inspiring many to act with more empathy and generosity. Richard's restaurant continued to thrive, not only as a place for meals, but as a symbol of hope and transformation. Paul, now a valuable member of the team, continued to work tirelessly to help others and share his story. As Richard looked to the future, he knew there was still much to be done. He and his team were committed to expanding their charitable initiatives and finding new ways to support the community. The journey that started with a simple act of rejection had evolved into a life mission for everyone involved. Will the community manage to maintain this spirit of empathy and generosity? How will Richard and Paul continue to impact the lives of those around them? Don't miss the next chapters of this emotional story. If you enjoyed this so far, leave a like to support the channel. Inspired by the success of the restaurant and Paul's story, Richard decided to expand his charitable initiatives. He began collaborating with other local businesses to create a support network for the homeless and those in need. Together, they organized community events, food drives, and job training programs. Richard also sought partnerships with NGOs and charitable organizations to maximize the impact of their efforts. The restaurant became a central hub for coordinating these initiatives, and Richard took on a leadership role in promoting social responsibility among local entrepreneurs. Meanwhile, Paul continued his personal growth journey. With the support of Richard and the community, he completed his studies and started working at a non-profit organization dedicated to helping the homeless. His personal experience made him especially qualified to understand and address the needs of those he served. Paul also became a frequent speaker at events and conferences, where he shared his story and inspired others to act with empathy and compassion. He used his voice to advocate for public policies that supported the most vulnerable, always reminding everyone that a small act of kindness can change a life. The transformations didn't stop with Paul and Richard. Many of the restaurant's staff and even regular customers were inspired to do more for their community. Volunteering, donations, and acts of kindness became part of the local culture, and Richard's restaurant was frequently cited as an example of how businesses can have a positive impact on society. Claire, who played a crucial role in Paul's transformation, also saw her life change. She became more deeply involved in charitable activities and advocacy, using her skills and resources to help even more people. Her friendship with Paul grew stronger, and together, they became a powerful force for good in the community. Richard frequently reflected on the journey everyone had undertaken. What started as a simple decision to eject a homeless man from the restaurant had evolved into a life mission that positively impacted many people. He realized that true wealth was not in financial profits, but in contributing to the well-being of others. The community around the restaurant rallied around this philosophy. People from different backgrounds and walks of life began collaborating, creating a robust support network that benefited everyone. Richard felt a deep satisfaction seeing how his change in perspective had triggered a series of positive events. The story of Paul and Richard became a legacy of kindness and transformation. The restaurant continued to be a beacon of hope and generosity, and its actions inspired many others to act with compassion. Paul's life, which had begun with challenges and difficulties, was now a shining example of resilience and the human capacity for transformation through the kindness of others. Richard, Paul, Claire, and everyone involved knew that the work was far from over. They were committed to continuing their charitable initiatives and promoting a culture of empathy and solidarity. Together, they demonstrated that even the smallest acts of kindness can have a profound and lasting impact. How has the story of Paul and Richard inspired you? What other changes will they bring to the community? Don't miss the other videos on the channel to continue being inspired by emotional and transformative stories. Watch now and join us on this journey of empathy and generosity.